Our first talk is processing antecedent target mismatches under verb phrase ellipsis is difficult, but if they are predictable, you can, by Robin Lemke, Lisa Schäfer, Heiner, Drenhaus, and Ingo Reich. Go ahead.
So thank you very much. As the title already says, our presentation is about verb phrase ellipsis, and for those maybe who are not that aware of the phenomenon, in principle, this is just the omission of a verb phrase, basically in conjoined structures as one here in case of our studies. That is something like John gave Anne a book and Sue did too. And in this utterance, we have an omitted verb phrase, which is give Anne a book in the second conjunct. And in the literature, it's been in general, or it has been assumed for a long time, that some kind of identity needs to hold between the antecedent, which is gave Anne a book here, the red thing, and the target of ellipsis here, which I'm going to show you in blue. And the problem now is that, as is also been shown in the literature, that it's not always that easy that we have perfect identity, but that it can differ, even though it has been argued that in examples like 2a here, Anne was given a book by John and Sue did give Anne a book too, there is a mismatch between the antecedent and target, in this case in terms of voice, and the thing is ungrammatical. However, as I just said, it has been shown for a long time that it's not always the case that mismatches are ungrammatical. For instance, consider to be instead by Andrew Keeler in an example. This problem was to have been looked into, but obviously nobody did. Again, here we've got a voice mismatch, but the thing is quite acceptable according to the literature. And just to show you a second one, like this one here from Daniel Hart, here we have a nominal antecedent. David Begelman is a great laugher, the noun phrase. And when he does laugh, his eyes crinkle. So again, here we've got no identity between antecedent and target, and nevertheless, VPE seems to be quite okay. So basically what is the observation? So that some but not all mismatches are acceptable, but others are quite bad. And the research questions that we are investigating with this talk are basically two ones. First of all, how are particular mismatches, why are particular mismatches under verb phrase ellipsis acceptable or unacceptable? And second, how can these acceptability contrasts be integrated in a more comprehensive theory of verb phrase ellipsis? So to show you briefly what I'm going to talk about today, first of all, I'm discussed in very short way previous approaches to VPE mismatches. Then I'm presenting an information theoretic account of the acceptability of VPE mismatches. And then I'm going to show you 3 experiments which tests the predictions of the information theoretic account, which consists in basically, first of all, a rating study measuring the acceptability of mismatches in particular context, then to show that the target differs in likelihood across these conditions, which is reflected in processing effort differences, and which in turn, according to our account, explains why these mismatches are acceptable or not in this case. Just to start, of course, we are not the first ones that investigate these things, but it has been done for about some decades. So the first possibility to address these mismatches is to say that those mismatches which are acceptable aren't really mismatches. And just to show you 2 accounts which have been argued for this. First one is about voice mismatches, as the example that I showed you. This problem was to be looked into, but obviously nobody did. Here, Merch in 2013 has argued that in principle what we have here is in a generative syntactic framework something like a voice phrase, which has the target of ellipsis, and therefore what is omitted in these examples here is actually identical to what's been realized syntactically, but just there's some superordinate structure which survives ellipsis. In a similar vein, Johnson 2001 has argued that some nouns may be deverbal, and they contain also a verbal head. So if we have again this example here and we omit laugh in the case of does here, this is actually contained in the noun laugher, and so again ellipsis is licensed under identity. The question now is, from this perspective, why are not all of these mismatches acceptable? And here it has been argued by Kim and colleagues 2011 that there are processing constraints which are also known like maxilite, that is prefer the omission of larger constituents, or a tendency to realize arguments of verbs in canonical order that is post-verbally, which also has been taken to explain why some of these mismatches are out. The opposite possibility to saying that mismatches are mismatches and are perfectly grammatical after all is to say that mismatches are real mismatches, but we can in some case reconstruct or accommodate a matching antecedent. And one possibility that has been suggested here is the VP recycling hypothesis by Aregi and colleagues 2006, who claim that mismatches are overall ungrammatical, but in some cases we can use the material that we have attained in the antecedent to reconstruct a matching antecedent. And if this reconstruction, which proceeds by syntactic derivation, is rather easy, then ellipsis is more acceptable and the other way around. And I'm going to show you the materials of their study because we are using the same ones for ours later on. What they did here was to investigate 4 conditions of increasing divergence between the antecedent verb phrase here, saw the comet, and the target did see the comet here. In the A example here, it's straightforwardly available, and through the embedding here, seeing the comet, the extraction of the VP here in the C condition and the negative adjective here, unseeable, the degree of similarity between antecedent and target increasingly increases, and they show an acceptability rating study that also people perceive this, the VPE here, as increasingly degraded. So A is best, and B is significantly worse, C again, D again is significantly worse. And yeah, an alternative possibility to this is that we don't need syntactic reconstruction, but that we can use accommodation under particular situations for saying that, for instance, pronouns, the copula, and so on can be accommodated, but other things which are focused or not given cannot. The problem now for all of these basically syntactic accounts is that they can't explain the whole range of the data, because there are more recent studies which show that there are effects of discourse structure and information structure on the acceptability of mismatches, which cannot be explained by structural differences between antecedent and target. Just to show you this example here, which most of, or some of you probably might know, which is by Andrew Keeler. This problem was looked into by John, and Bob did too. Here it's shown that this thing looks quite odd, even though the same things conjoined with but in the other example were quite acceptable. So Keeler's idea is that it depends on the discourse relation, and if we have a parallel discourse relation, we expect also parallel continuation. Therefore, the mismatch is degraded because it violates this assumption. In that case here with and if we have another discourse connective like because or but, it can nonetheless be acceptable. Similarly, Laura Kurtz, 2013, has argued that it's based on information structure whether mismatches are acceptable, that when we have contrastive topic structures between the antecedent and the target in the conjuncts, then it's fine. But if we don't, it's not fine. And for instance, in this case here, the incident was reported by the driver and the pedestrian did too. Here, it seems to be odd because the incident and the pedestrian are not in a contrastive topic relation, and therefore the mismatch is not licensed, what she argues. Beyond this, it's also been argued that implicit questions under discussion and implicatures can play a role here. For instance, just to show you this example 8 by Miller and Hemforth, 2014, the integrity of the Senate depends on her participation, if he does, or his participation, sorry, if he does, and so on. They argue that in this case, it's fine because this depends on participation here, raises a question under discussion, like whether or not he will participate, and therefore the VPE refers to the question, and this licenses the whole thing. On the other hand, if we don't have these constructions which trigger implicit QEDs or other implicatures in the Grant et al. Study, then we don't license mismatches. And finally, what it's also been shown even more recently that not only these linguistic context things, but also extra linguistic contexts play a role here and can also license verb phrase ellipsis, even though there is a possible way of resolving ellipsis linguistically, people rely on extra linguistic context. So taken together, this speaks against purely syntactic accounts, and it suggests that taken together, mismatches improve when the target of ellipsis is relatively likely or predictable, be it through information structure, the discourse connective here, or other pragmatic factors. So this brings us straightforwardly to the account that we propose for VP ellipsis, which is based on information theory. Probably most of you know that it's been also applied to a lot of other omission phenomena like article omission, like complementizer omission, like other grammatical marker omission. And what the approach basically is about that we propose is that predictability indexes processing effort, as we know since Hale 2001 and Levy 2008, for instance. And that we can quantify this effort by Shannon information using the negative log of the probability of a word or expression in context. And just to show you how we think that it might work for VPE mismatches, just consider this example again here. Non-Austrian astronomers saw the comet, where we've got a parallel antecedent here, and we're plotting hypothetical information on the y-axis and the words or time on the x-axis. And we assume, of course, that there is an upper bound to processing resources, which can be thought of as channel capacity information theory. And we should communicate at a rate close to this capacity, but not exceeding it to be efficient. And the idea is that if we have something that makes the target verb phrase here really likely, like the parallel antecedent, we get a trough here in the profile that is inefficient. And if we in turn use verb phrase ellipsis, the whole thing gets densified and it's more efficient in that case. Now consider the opposite case where VPE is bad. In case of this negative adjective condition, for instance, here the comet was nearly unseeable, but John did. In that case, we expect if we do, or we hypothesize that if we do not expect the verb phrase and we reduce it, it gets difficult for people. We might exceed their processing capacities, and then things people perceive it as degraded. In contrast here, if we have the overall the complete VP, it might be less predictable, but still easy to comprehend. So in that case here, we should go for the less dense and more redundant encoding. So the general prediction applied to these materials here is that we have a stronger preference for VPE when the target is predictable. And we expected that if the antecedent is similar to what's submitted here, we might also expect that it gets more likely that the verb phrase here saw the comet would appear here, and then people are more likely to reduce it. And of course, that needs to be tested. So what we did was conduct three experiments. First of all, a rating study, which measures the acceptability of verb phrase ellipsis and these conditions replicating Arabian colleagues. Second, we use a production task to measure how likely this target verb phrase is in context of the antecedent and the subject here. And finally, we use the self-paced reading paradigm to measure whether it's really differs in processing effort across these conditions. So for the acceptability rating study, we had basically two research questions. First of all, we just wanted to replicate the pattern by Arabian colleagues. And second, we also wanted to see whether it's specific to mismatch to ellipsis, or whether it might be, at least in part, due to general preference to have non-mismatching structures between antecedent and target, which also has been evidenced in previous studies. Materials were the same. We used the 2x4 design, crossing completeness and antecedent, and tested completeness between subjects to keep things parallel to the Aregi study, who also tested only ellipsis in their experiment in their first one. And we used the 7-point Likert scale here with labeled endpoints where 7 was acceptable. And I'm going to present these conditions here, and the colors that I show you so just think about blue being the most acceptable one and orange the supposedly to be most difficult and worst one. So coming to the results, what we find is pretty much the same as Aregi did. We get a nice gradual pattern here. 2 out of the 3 contrasts are significant here between conditions. The middle one here is marginal in the ellipsis data, and we replicate this pattern. In the non-elliptical controls, which was basically the same with the present verb phrase in the second conjunct, we find a pretty different pattern. So it's obvious, and the analysis also shows it, that there are all interactions between the completeness and the ellipsis contrast, antecedent contrast here are significant. So what we do is we replicate their effect, and we also find that it's ellipsis specific indeed. So now the production study had basically also 2 research questions or 2 goals. The first one was to see whether the target is indeed more likely across these conditions as we hypothesized. And second, of course, if we ask people to produce continuations, if they also produce verb phrase ellipsis, and if so, in the expected direction. Therefore, we had a free production task using the same materials cut off after John in the second conjunct, and we just had people complete this without, we told them not to be really funny or interesting, but just to produce whatever they thought was most likely to follow. And I skipped the annotation details for reasons of time, so just coming to the results. What you see here is on the x-axis, again, the conditions, on the y-axis, the ratio of what we labeled a parallel verb phrase produced, which could be reduced, of course, by VPE or other strategies like do so and FRA, or it could be a complete verb phrase like saw the comet in that case. And in this case, again, the middle contrast here is not significant, but the other ones are in K, and actually. So we also find evidence, again, for a gradual pattern here across conditions. For the question how people use verb phrase ellipsis, we find something quite similar. Again, this here is the ratio of verb phrase ellipses among these parallel continuations. Okay, so basically the blue bar here, the 27% or so, is the complete bar here, because we would not expect VPE to be something else than the parallel thing which is given in the antecedent. And also here we find a similar pattern due to few data here. This one is not significant but marginal, but the other two ones here are. So again, we find a gradual decrease across conditions which goes in the expected direction. Yeah, we can talk later on about embedding of VPE, which I also omit here for reasons of space. Yeah, so taken together, when the target is likely, VPE is more acceptable in the first place, and it's comparing it with the rating data, and we find here that it's also more likely to be produced. Now, finally, the previous two studies now show that there is a relationship between acceptability of verb phrase ellipses, production preference, and likelihood. But in the plots I showed you before, we made a crucial link through processing effort. And what we did to measure this processing effort was to run a self-paced reading experiment, again web-based, which investigated the two questions. First of all, if VPE is harder to process when the target is less likely, and whether VPE is perceived as less acceptable. We used this judgment task also because in the Reich study they also had a binary judgment task, just to be able to relate also processing effort to the perceived acceptability in this study here. The materials were again pretty much the same as before, only that we added a spillover region to measure effort not only on the auxiliary but also on the words following it. And yeah, basically now I'm coming to the results. I omitted judgment data because they are pretty much, I have them in the appendix if you're interested, but they are pretty much in line with the other rating data. So I come just to the reading times here. First of all, we looked into two regions, the auxiliary itself did, and the spillover region. And what you see here are reading times for the auxiliary. So it looks a bit like a trend in the direction that it gets harder in conditions where VP is least acceptable. So this one the most easy. But as you see, the contrasts are not significant. Also probably because it's just the same word always did, and a very small region. But where we find effects is in the spillover region. The first three words following this auxiliary did, where ellipsis becomes apparent. Here again, we use basically the same coding, and we find that one significant effect in the main analysis, which is that this negative adjective condition is read more slowly than the other ones. Among these three here, we see a gradual pattern, but we find no significant effect in the main analysis. However, then we did pairwise comparisons to test whether there's significance between this one and this one here. And again, it's significant. So we find some evidence for a gradual pattern again in the reading times here. That is in line with the previous two experiments. So wrapping up, what is our main finding, of course, that we interpret this as support for the information theoretic account. We find gradual differences between conditions in all three experiments, and they were basically in the expected direction. As you saw, not all of the effects were significant, all of the contrast, but the pattern overall were pretty similar. And overall, we conclude that if verb phrase ellipsis is more when the target is more likely, VPE becomes more acceptable in the rating study. It becomes more often produced in the production study, and it's easier to process in the self-paced reading task. And of course, this speaks to our account, but we should also discuss very briefly what other accounts that I showed you have to say about this. First of all, of course, syntactic identity accounts without no processing component have really a hard time because the effects are gradual, so it appears that they cannot fully explain the patterns that we observe. And they are also about very particular instances of VPE, like these voice mismatches. And if we don't have any, the account of voice mismatches, of course, doesn't have anything to say about this. As for the VP recycling hypothesis, based on whose experiment by Reich and colleagues, on whose experiment we based ours, they predict, of course, similar reading time and rating patterns because the effort is obviously also reflected in reading times that they predict. However, I would argue that we provide a more simple explanation for the data because information theoretic and predictive processing has also been shown to constrain other phenomena, and we don't need a mechanism which is really specific to verb phrase ellipsis like this. Use the antecedent to reconstruct a matching target by syntactic derivation that they propose to account for the data. And of course, they would also need to explain why in the production task, we found that VPE is produced even in conditions where they argue it's ungrammatical. I mean, there are accounts in the market why people would say something ungrammatical if it's more useful, but I think that should be would have to be spelled out here more in detail. And yeah, the information structural account by Kurtz relies crucially on contrastive topics. However, as you saw in the materials, maybe there's a contrastive topic between none of the astronomers and John or so, but in the other conditions not. So in all of the conditions where there's no such relation, the information structural account cannot really explain the pattern that we find. So taken together, I conclude that the information theoretic account explains the data without a specific mechanism for verb phrase ellipsis, and it also integrates, of course, nicely with the other source of predictability that I showed you on the more recent studies, the pragmatic ones and the ones taking extralinguistic context into account, because all of this affects predictability. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much. We have time for some questions, and it looks like we have one at the student microphone.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
so.
Lalitha Balachandran from UC Santa Cruz. I have two questions. I guess I'll start with the first. It's a question about, I guess, this argument against the information structural account. I'm wondering, since in many of the cases where we do see naturalistic examples of mismatches in VPE, because there's typically context leading up to that, and the fact that there are these observations about preferences for parallelism, whether you think maybe if you had preceding contexts before your target sentences, whether that would have changed your production results at all. Yeah, especially because I wonder if, so I think you pointed out that here they observed this contrast between none of the astronomers and John, but for example, if you had something like a contrast between seeing the comet was nearly impossible versus like seeing the shooting star or something like that, it might have been more predictable or more expected for people to continue with VPE, as opposed to seeing the comet was nearly impossible and John. So.
You mean in the second question without, if I would not have John in the second conjunct, but something else? Of course. I mean, of course, would also, I think we would make similar predictions. If we've got an antecedent which is seeing the comet and we don't have John, maybe they would contrast seeing the comet with something else, definitely. But the idea here was to see whether we can, since we wanted to see whether we can account for the acceptability data, which we are presented by Aragian colleagues without context. We also presented everything without context. And in relation to this, for your first question, I think we would definitely expect to see effects of context if there were more context before the sentences. And I mean, that would also expect shape what people expect to come up, and maybe even it could reverse effects if we have got a very strong preference or very strong expectation that the sentence continues in a way because of previous context. Maybe if you have something like John was trying all night to see the comet was unseeable, but John and so on, then you might get a different preference. Maybe it's a stupid example that I just made, but I think you might, through context, you might actually shape predictability of the target, and therefore would expect context, if it does, to also affect, of course, the acceptability of mismatches. So the experiment, of course, is a bit artificial in a way. On the other hand, we keep all of these factors out. I mean, there are these other studies that I had very briefly on the slide, which look into context in a more complicated and comprehensive fashion, and yeah, we also find effects there.
Okay, thank you. And if I could ask a second question, I was wondering about the idea you have here about the VP recycling hypothesis. So I guess I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about what the relation between comprehension and production is in these cases for like reconstructing mismatching VPE. Yeah, I guess that's the question.
Okay, I mean, it depends, I think, a bit on the theory that you have of VPE. whether you assume, for instance, that you've got really linguistic structure at the target that you must build somehow, and which of course you can predict it in a way. And if you like this, you could say, okay, if I expect that there's something going on with John and the comet, you maybe predict the syntactic structure in that sense. But I mean, there are other accounts who do not necessarily claim that you've got linguistic structure at the site. So maybe it would be just like some kind of pronoun, like these anaphoric accounts, which say you've got something like a silent pronoun, and then you say just, okay, you need to resolve the identity of this pronoun. If you've got something salient in context, then you might do it. I mean, as for the relationship here, of course, the information theoretic account, as we've put it, implies that people, if they produce it because they think that you can process it, of course, and not. So it's should be some kind of audience design in there. So
I see.
if
Okay.
you think it's predictable for yourself, or you think it's predictable for the listener, then you would maybe reduce it in a way, and not the other way around.
I see. Thank you.
Jennifer, are you okay with me going next? Okay. Yeah. Amanda Riesling, also UC Santa Cruz. So I think I have something that might be helpful to you or related, possibly. You'll tell me. Sandy Chung, right, the theoretical syntactician, noticed a while ago that there are these things that shouldn't be good but kind of are, like John insulted Mary, but she did first, or John danced with Mary and she did too. And Sandy, as far as she could tell, said that these happen especially in contexts of love, conflict, and negotiation, right? But what's that natural class? That Balachandran has a paper in Sinn und Bedeutung's proceedings last year, in which she argues that all of these things naturally raise this question of, how is the response going to happen? What is the socially reciprocal thing that may or may not happen because of the norm of reciprocity, right? So a thing that we have because we're human but not linguistic. And this seems to me like it would be consistent with what you're showing here. If it's naturally a thing that we think of, right? Oh no, how are they going to respond to a thing that the person just did to them or said about them or asked them for? This could be a reason why it would be in some way predictable as like the next thing we're going to encounter. So I wonder, I mean, do you have any insight into what you calculated over how many of these examples might have been leading to love, conflict, or negotiation?
So you mean the production data, or?
Your estimates before, right? Like for an information theoretic account, you're going to have to say how much information is going to.
Yeah, of course.
Right.
I mean, it's always difficult to measure it. I think what you're saying makes perfect sense. So we would expect that basically all sources of information that you have, be it linguistic or non-linguistic expectations, might shape your expectations about what comes, and should also, in that case, affect the acceptability of these mismatches. But I think it's really, and that's why we did the production study, because it's really not so easy, and that's why these other estimates are also hypothetical, because really difficult to measure the predictability of things in context. Specifically in verb phrase ellipsis, when we've got extra linguistic context, I mean, you could think of studies presenting people in situations with videos or so and having them say something, of course. And I think that's basically what would be necessary to do in order to really measure the predictability of these things in context, and to see whether information theory would provide an account for the examples that you just mentioned, I think. But that would be a different task to do it, because of course you need some model of context, and yeah. Thank you.
All right, let's thank our speaker.
Thank you.